Welcome back, folks, to episode 31 of the Running Man Self-Regulation Skills and Self-Improvement Project podcast with me, your host, Dr. Armando Dominguez, PhD in health psychology, also a licensed professional counselor and an adjunct professor at a local community college. So what we're going to do today, we're going to discuss the art of peace. We're going to discuss the art of war. We're going to discuss conflict in general, and also what is it that elicits being in a state of conflict with another human being. So for today, we're going to be discussing the application of the shadow self in communication, social relations, and life in general. So to start off with, I'm going to give a couple of examples of what would seem a very unusual exemplar, I should say, of peace in particular. And one of these was a martial artist. His name was Morihei Ueshiba, and he was the creator of Aikido. There are probably quite a few proponents out there that are listening that may practice Aikido. And the name Aikido means the way of harmony, Do meaning way, Aiki means to unify, I means to unify or harmonize, Ki having to do with energy or the force applied by an individual that is in conflict and harmonizing immediately. It is an art of peace that does not seek to damage the opponent. So, in essence, it embodies the idea of being peaceful even whenever someone attempts to be in conflict. Now, there are some things that we have to consider here. Ueshiba, when he got to the point of enlightenment, it was within his lifetime at age 50, after having been in war in Manchuria, having had to kill. But yet, through his practices and his meditation and stillness, he was able to acquire that higher level and recognizing peace being the goal and being the true spirit of what martial art was about in the first place. And from this point is where we'll launch forward into the art of peace. He wrote a book called The Art of Peace, and it's something that I've read before, but much of it sounds almost like haiku, very simple, but it was also a very Zen-like simplicity, speaking to the moment. But the idea was not to damage others and recognize the divinity, so to speak, within all people in the world. And he saw it cross the globe in his late 80s, whenever he was very elderly and unable to walk, but was still quite capable at dispatching numbers of his students and doing it with relatively little effort and no damage to them. So he definitely created an art that was more peaceful and less damaging to what we would call an opponent. But he also mentioned that when we were in harmony, we realized that that opponent out there is a reflection of self, and therefore one cannot be in conflict as one is walking in that light, so to speak, that my opponent is me, by recognizing that divinity. So it was a very high realization he had. So how does this apply to self-regulation? Since this is what this podcast is about, self-regulatory skill. Part of it has to do with recognizing that whenever we are looking at physical stress, anxiety, depression, sense of helplessness, hopelessness, and also a sense of fear or terror, that we are physically experiencing in our body a level of stress that is not only uncomfortable, but makes us more apt to be suggestible, to believe what it is that things look like versus how they actually are, and also makes us more apt to be reactive versus responsive, meaning mindful in the moment and thinking things out that actually will allow us to make a choice in the future, whereas being reactive, we may or may not have one. And we may actually lose one to the law if there's something of that extreme occurring. But also, we could also reactively jump from the frying pan into the fire, trying to merely get away from the heat and falling into the actual source itself. So there are definitely some limitations. But as far as self-regulation goes, when we realize that our body is a physical vehicle and that there are certain things that we experience that we do not have conscious control over, if something suddenly occurs, we've talked about perception before, and anything faster than 150 to 300 milliseconds, even though that's incredibly fast. Uh, Within that 150 to 300 milliseconds, we can still differentiate approach, avoid, good or bad. When it gets faster than 100 milliseconds, it's when it gets sketchy and we start to tend toward the extreme reactive, but also towards the attribution of the negative in the sense that all things that come up because they are too fast, I have to, by default, treat them as a danger because even if it's a fluffy teddy bear banging, winning lottery tickets and candy gifts to us, at that speed scares the hell out of us, and it's best that we smack that little bugger out of the way or run away from it because we don't know. We can't tell. We can't recognize it. When it gets to the 30 millisecond range, there is no way we can interpret that as anything other than incredibly fast, and we may actually uh, be in a state that we cannot control at that point. And it is a pre-conscious reactivity. So, whenever Ueshiba mentioned in his Art of Peace about creating harmony, often, in many cases, an encounter will have several things involving it. One is distance. And distance, of course, is time in the physical sense, because if I have 30 feet away from you, I have at least that much distance or the time it takes for them to cross to us if they're aggressing us for us to run. So it's a head start. And that's a survival head start, which I'd love to have if ever anything like that happens, because fighting isn't the only answer. But what if you're unable to run? What if you cannot because you're hobbled, you're aged, you're hurt, or this person or creature or thing that's occurring is much faster, like a tidal wave rolling in, and I can't get away from it? Then we have other issues. But those are very real things that we have to accept and determine whether or not we're going to act or not, or how we're going to act. And part of that is the suggestion from the environment, so to speak, that we've been discussing up until now throughout all of these podcast episodes. So, the art of peace, back to that. How can I engender that? How can I discourage conflict? We're going to have conflict at some point, especially if we get in a tit for tat discussion of things, or we get into a debate and we get emotionally charged. I say we, as in not just ourselves, but also the person with whom we may be interacting with, because at that point we become a dyad. We become a group of minimum two, and it can grow, of course. Group dynamics being what they are, sometimes if we're out in public, we may have people that are watching, people that maybe are too happy to join right in, regardless of whose side, just because they like the excitement and the physical, emotional charge. And there are those people out there. I'm sure you've met them. Hopefully, you're not one of them. And if you are, then this podcast is for you. So, is it that we're talking about when we're discussing harmony, whenever there's discord or conflict? Often, one of the first things that conflict arises from is from a disagreement or a misunderstanding if it's been verbalized. We're not talking about a physical confrontation yet. We'll get there in a moment. But sometimes it's an idea that is brought upon us much too quickly. And it may be if somebody delivers the message to us in a way that's much too fast, loud, or abrupt, it may actually cause us to react versus respond. And just like a sudden sound can be very shocking, it can put us into a state of unknown or ambiguity. Mind you, those two things are big in development of fear. There's also a risk assessment that happens within that fraction of a moment, too, that within that incident may cause us to attribute things to a negative versus a potential positive. So, how can I engender or encourage harmony? One is try to understand. Sometimes, whenever someone does the verbiage that is very offensive or delivers it in a loud manner or very suddenly or abruptly, and maybe even with body language, one of the first things is that if we are in a state of balance, physical balance, actually feeling like you're on your feet and capable, that assists. If we're in between taking a step when that happens, we tend to actually shudder or shark, maybe even duck a little bit, because that causes our body to respond. We're more resilient when we're on our solid 2 feet, rooted, so to speak, not necessarily like a rock, but rather where our arches and heels and the balls of our feet and our toes are actually all in contact with the ground. It makes us more able to feel able to deal with something that's coming into our perceptual field from the side or from the front. So that is a physical tool for self-regulation that I just unloaded right there. Definitely one to take note of. And also the next part, whenever somebody is approaching quickly, read the body language. If we can read body language at 150, rather 500 meters at a distance on a flat plane at 150 feet, or less than that, 50 feet or even 30 feet, you can tell when somebody becomes tense and abrupt and they break from what otherwise would be the more at ease feel or flow of the collective body language. And there is one. When someone is out of sync with the remainder of those that are in public, you will know they stick out like a sore thumb. That is another self-regulatory skill that has to do with reading the body language and also listening for the tonals too, that will give us a signal as to whether or not we need to prepare or at least avoid, and that may give us that 30-second dead run that I tend to joke about. So harmony sometimes requires that we be aware and not take offense and realize that at that distance, and if somebody's getting upset and you don't know them from Adam nor Eve, then you realize maybe you didn't do anything and maybe it's something within them. That's the first step in understanding that we would call the compassionate perspective. And that is the level 2 lens that we talked about. The have I walked a mile in your moccasins, so to speak, the compassionate perspective. And that also helps us have an empathic sense of what's going on whenever we are visiting with them, and not necessarily taking on the load for them, but maybe just listening and allowing them to speak their mind without being contentious and telling people, well, you can't talk to me this way, because that may shut the door and may also irritate somebody that may have had some bad going on in their day before you ever became part of it. So just some ideas. One of the things that in the art of peace is the ideas of not only harmony with others, but also harmony with self. Being in that state of harmony requires that we be calm and also learn how to be still. And this isn't going to be woo teaching, but rather practical teaching. If those of you are inclined to the biblical, have read scripture that speaks of be still and know that I am God. That stillness is the part wherever we come in contact with that part that gives us that resilience internally and strength, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually for many, by that stillness first. And in that stillness is wherever that ability to understand and have compassion for another arises, versus being so physically stressed that I can only think about my own immediate survival at that point, especially whenever maybe it's not a survival situation, but my anxiety kicks up as if it is. So self-awareness, it's a very important tool. So being still is something that cross-culturally we've all learned. The one skill, the one thing that must be learned is not only the stillness, but the breath control. Not stopping the breath or holding the breath dynamically and holding it under pressure, but rather understanding that how we breathe is very reflective of the state of body that we are in. And if our body is in a state of disorder or disarray or stress, my question to you, and this is absolutely rhetorical, is am I giving off signals of tension that can be misinterpreted as stressed, weak, aggressive, irritable? Those are some good questions. Tough questions, but still. Self-knowledge is the first wisdom. And once we achieve that, we can help others by understanding them when we interact with them and also showing them how to understand self. So that way we can seed that peace by teaching people how to manage their state, their physical state of stress that may be occurring that can also lead to conflict, not meaning to, not intending to. Whenever we stress, we tend to be very jumpy to body language that looks tense and stressed, whenever we really are full well meaning to do something that is kind and peaceful, but yet maybe we're under stress trying to get from here to there, and someone may misunderstand what it is that we're doing. So by being still and being in breath, so to speak, not out of breath, like anxiety, panting, or hyperventilation, we are more apt to give the signals of peace, calm, and harmony, which is what we want. and what we'd like to see mirrored in those that we interact with. And the more we can embody that and exhibit that, demonstrate that, become exemplars of that, not just in our day to day, but our moment to moment, we get a greater degree of quality in our life in the immediate moment that we can actually carry over into the future. So, most definitely a very cool thing. So, the next part, what I'll be discussing is the art of war. And I'll be harkening back to Musashi and his Book of Five Rings as well, because there are some common parallels there that were incredibly useful, that were born out of very dangerous times when your life was in danger every time you stepped out of the door and walked across a field or walking town to town. You could have been set on by brigands, by strangers, by even locals that would get angry, and because they were so isolated, often a group or a village would unite and sometimes kill a person because they heard something and one person said something else. And this is a really bad version of the game of telephone, wherever the gossip starts on one end and the message is garbled and is nothing like what was initially spoken in the first place, but by virtue of a degrading interpretation. People have died as a result. These assumptions, carried by badly spoken, badly repeated message with the lowest degree of fidelity and clarity, have cost lives. So whenever we have clarity, good things. And Musashi spoke of following an inner light, so he meditated and breathed frequently. So being calm in the moment and not having a highly reactive emotional state, and seeing things the way they are, not the way we think they are, that people say they are, not by opinion or by an emotionally laden opinion we develop because of whatever associations we have, or because my family says so and I'm going to lose whatever acceptance if I don't toe the political line, but rather how things actually are. This is cutting through the crap, but now also is cutting away all the unnecessary emotional baggage, so that way you can make the best decision in a moment whenever things can become stressful. But it works exceedingly well whenever things are calm and safe. And you realize that you have so much more emotional capital at the end of the day by using this tool, because you're not wasting it on having feelings about things that may or may not be true, or that politics are going on in the world and this is bad and this is that and that is that. This does not mean to not involve yourself in such things if those are important to you. What it means is sometimes we have to listen and more data, gather more information. The more data you have, if you get to a point of impasse during conflict, gather more data. You can say, you know what, I understand what you're saying, but I think we need more information. And that is a fair assessment, but also gives you more time and may allow another person to calm down a little bit. Not necessarily you tell them to calm down, probably not a good practice, but rather by you demonstrating calm and you speaking to them, telling them, well, you need more information, versus having to commit because they may take on this role of I have to get people to accept my message or to endorse my message, which is marketing and salesmanship done on an interpersonal level. And that may not be the best thing. Often, whenever we're most afraid is whenever we most need the group. Now, we're wired to the group, to the village, to the band, to the family, to whatever it is that is larger than us, that results out of numbers of people gathered together. The groupthink can be a powerful thing in a good way when it's motivated into action to do good things for the greater good. That's okay. But it's a horrendous thing when it goes awry, when it goes bad, when there are negative things going on and there's a diffusion of responsibility where people do things that are bad, where there's a loss of accountability, responsibility for actions done, and whenever people start losing or shedding themselves of their social masks, and then the dark side emerges, the actual bad side of the dark side, where everybody's inner Darth Vader, so to speak, is allowed to walk, and then going around harming things, people, and taking as if there is no law or guideline. And if we really look at things the way they are, we understand that those are social contracts, those are social assumptions. Laws and guidelines are understandings that we agree to live within. It's an agreement. It is not an actuality. Laws do not exist. There are writings that support those ideas, and we have courts to support them. But these are not tangible objects. They're subjective ideas that we have on paper that we guide our societies with. So whenever people drop past that and below that level, they are in a survival mode or a predatory mode. Often predatory are the ones that walk within the spaces between of the written word that make it really hard to deal with folks whenever they're exacting their anger, their upset, the manipulations and machinations to get their way, to get what they want. And besides, you're only holding on to those things right now for me because they're really mine. You just don't know that yet, which is a very criminal mindset, I would say. Manipulative mindset, yes. But it's also rather real when people decide to work that way, and they're not necessarily good things, but they're legitimately strategies that can be used, have been used to create influence and change in the physical world. But we don't like when we do that because they're kind of dark, and that's okay. Nothing wrong with you not using those. It's okay to keep those in the closet, or probably just not to use them at all. But it's best as an educational point to know that they exist, so that way you can see it coming down the pipes and you can prevent it and evade it if you can, to the best of your ability in a harmonious sense. But the fact of the matter is, we have to realize that even though the art of peace came from a martial artist that saw much war, saw much carnage in his lifetime, he was still quite capable of physically protecting himself, even into his late 80s. And that says a lot. So, the most popular thing that I've seen that many people have been iterating, reiterating, and making memes about is this adage that it is better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. And to take this at its fullest would be to realize that it's not just about war, but rather about life and conflict. But also realizing that this message implies that we be physically resilient, mentally resilient, emotionally resilient, that we have flexibility in response. Not that we resist all, but it's not the path of no resistance, which is a misinterpretation of the path of least resistance besides, which flowing with water, they say is non-resistant. Well, it does resist to a degree, or else it wouldn't keep its shape. Even flowing around, it binds to itself. So there is an active component there. And once again, the path of no resistance is not the path of least resistance, and is truly a path of non-doing and inaction. But the path of least resistance is one of a very dynamic flexibility and response. But it's also a good survival tool that is efficient, energy efficient, so you don't tire yourself out unnecessarily whenever things may become a little turbulent. But the warrior in the garden, do you have to be a martial artist? Do you have to be a soldier or a fighter? Not in the physical sense. If you're unable because maybe you're wheelchair bound, does this mean that you can't be a warrior? You may not be able to fight physically, but being resistant in your mind does not make you a warrior. It just means that you're resistant and stubborn. But whenever we have resistance as needed, judiciously applied, it can become very powerful. And this is where the art of war, Sun Tzu's art of war, speaks of what the warrior in the garden, or the garden in the war principle implies. Sun Tzu was actually a general, but he prized the art of war because it was one that did not necessarily involve conflict first, but rather providing influence and change that would peacefully change things by creating differences in opinion by use of spies and plants, of course, wherever one did not have to go in and do the most costly thing, and that was to create an opportunity to fight person to person, man to man, because the value of the loss of life was too costly to a country, and he was aware of that. One of the things that he wrote in his book, Art of War, was the most powerful sword is never drawn. So what's the point of the sword? One would think, in a very simplistic sense, the sword exists to cut people down. true enough. But the principle of the most powerful sword, or the best sword, is not drawn, indicates that one should have the resilience and the capacity, but also that one strategically one shouldn't have to. That there are other ways, and recognizing that there are other ways versus crash and slash and burn and pillage. And yet you can save and encourage that other country to be in harmony and to create a greater sense of being for those citizens there, and also to create a sense of loyalty over time that they can hopefully topple a government if necessary without necessarily having to strike a single blow or kill a single individual, and that was the idea. But his method was based on a discipline, a self-discipline. And being self-disciplined does not necessarily mean self-punishing. Many people misinterpret discipline as punishment, and those are some important distinctions and definitions that must be made. But when it comes to conflict, to be self-aware is a discipline that requires practice and repetition, but it does not necessarily require punishment, but an awareness of what's going on with me when I stress. How do I respond when I stress? What can I do when I stress? And how can I more effectively get myself from here to there if the stressful event is physical? Or if it's interaction that has gone bad, what can I do then? And can we revisit this? It's strategic. So the strength of discipline has to do with flexibility and response in the truest sense, in maintaining one's ability to respond mindfully and not react physically first, and then the highest level of our prefrontal cortex, making the best of our reasoning, gets hijacked by that lower brain that can be a little bit impish when it does its duties, so to speak, in protecting ourselves. And we don't want that necessarily, but understandably there will be times where it's necessary, so we have to keep them. That's our shadow self. That's our little shadow dude or person that does what it has to do, our personage that is all about keeping us alive. And there's really nothing wrong with that. So that's been about it for today. I just want to tell you thank you for passing this evening with me. And I just want to share this with you. And I encourage you to walk well, share this, and follow. And if you know anyone that could benefit from this, please pass this podcast along to them. Let them know about it. And we have some new things coming down the pipes, and I will let you know when we release those things on different platforms in particular. And certainly has been good talking to you. If you have any feedback for me, please send it to runningmangetskillsproject@gmail.com, and we'll be talking to you soon. Walk in peace. Walk well.